Step into the hidden world of 1920s Shanghai, a city shimmering with silk, jazz, and secrets. Behind the glittering facades of tea houses and dance halls live the forgotten courtesans. Women who ruled the nights with beauty, wit, and power. They were artists of illusion, weaving desire into empire and pleasure into politics. Beneath the perfume and pearls, however, lay a life of control, addiction, and longing. This is not just the story of luxury and sin. It's the untold history of how Shanghai's most desired women shaped its soul, then vanished into the smoke of time. At the turn of the 20th century, Shanghai was not just a city, it was a fever dream. Neon signs glowed above opium dens and gambling halls, and rickshaws rattled through the streets, where Western ambition and Eastern decadence collided. Known as the Paris of the East, it was a city of contradictions, of missionaries and smugglers, aristocrats and addicts, poets and prostitutes. The courtesans were its brightest jewels and its deepest tragedies. They lived in the flower houses, luxurious brothels where music, poetry, and opium intertwined into nightly rituals of seduction. These women were more than mere entertainers. They were performers of emotion, trained in the art of illusion. A single glance, a soft laugh, a poem recited by candlelight could earn them fortunes or ruin. Many of them were brought into the trade as young girls, sold by impoverished families to madams who promised refinement and wealth. In truth, it was gilded captivity. They were educated in calligraphy, literature, and music, not to free themselves, but to enchant men who could never love them. The opium pipe was their constant companion. In the dimly lit chambers, ivory smoke curled around silk robes as the courtesans drifted between conversation and dream. For them, opium was more than a vice. It was escape, comfort, and performance. Their pale faces, half hidden by smoke, seemed ethereal, like ghosts who danced for the living. Western visitors to Shanghai often describe the courtesan houses with fascination and disgust. To them, these women represented everything mysterious about the East, beautiful, dangerous, unknowable. Yet behind those painted faces lay stories of heartbreak, betrayal, and addiction that no foreign journalist ever wrote. In the 1920s, the flower houses stood at the heart of Shanghai's nightlife. Their walls had seen everything, from whispered political secrets to forbidden romances between warlords and foreign bankers. The women who lived there knew the power of silence. They were confidants, spies, and survivors in a world that offered them everything except freedom. By the end of each night, when the last guest staggered out and the music faded, the courtesans would retreat to their private rooms. There, the glamour slipped away. They would light another pipe, watch the smoke twist into fragile shapes, and whisper the same words in the dark. Just one more dream. Because in Shanghai, dreams were all they had, and even those were borrowed from smoke. By the 1910s, Shanghai had become a city of two faces, one wrapped in Western ambition, the other veiled in ancient decadence. The ports were busy with British and French ships, the streets filled with traders, soldiers, and dreamers who came chasing fortune. But when the sun dipped below the horizon and the gaslights flickered to life, a different empire emerged, the courtesans' empire, where desire was currency and illusion was law. These women were known as Ming-ji, the brilliant ones, and their world was one of both privilege and peril. Their flower houses stood in the international settlement and French concession, districts carved out by colonial powers who had turned Shanghai into their playground. Inside, everything gleamed: lacquered furniture, embroidered drapes, and mirrors imported from Paris. The courtesans themselves were dressed in the finest silks, their hair pinned with jade combs, their lips painted crimson like wounds beneath candlelight. To the outside world, they appeared powerful, women of mystery who could charm the most powerful men of their age. But their power was fragile, like the porcelain cups they held between trembling fingers. Behind every smile was fear, behind every laugh, exhaustion. The flower house was a stage, and they were its finest actors. The most famous among them became legends. Names like Cai Jinghua and Xia Fengxian drifted through gossip columns and political whispers alike. These women entertained generals, foreign ambassadors, and revolutionary thinkers. They were said to have influenced treaties, changed alliances, and even softened the hearts of warlords. But such stories were rarely told by them. They belonged to men who turned their lives into myths while forgetting their pain. At the center of it all was opium. The flower houses were not only theaters of pleasure, but also sanctuaries of smoke. Courtesans and their guests reclined on embroidered divans, passing the ivory pipe from hand to hand. The smoke rose like incense in a temple, blurring faces, dissolving reality. In those moments, men spoke truths they dared not utter in daylight, and women forgot, if only for an hour, that they were not free. Opium offered the courtesans control over their image. A dreamy haze softened their voices, slowed their movements, made their presence ethereal. But addiction was merciless. Many began to depend on the drug, not just for escape, but for survival. It dulled the pain of rejection, the loneliness of nights spent pretending to love. It was their secret companion when beauty faded and patrons disappeared. As Shanghai's nightlife flourished, so did its underworld. Tried bosses and smugglers controlled the opium trade, and many flower houses became fronts for trafficking. Some courtesans became intermediaries, using their charm to move information, money, or drugs across the city's invisible borders. Others were victims, caught between the greed of men and the hunger of addiction. And yet, through the danger and deceit, they created an art of survival unlike anything the world had seen. They hosted salons where poets recited verses of longing and scholars debated Western ideas. Their laughter could calm tempers, their silence could break alliances. They were both prisoners and queens, ruling over a realm built on desire and despair. By the 1920s, their world glittered brighter than ever, but the cracks had begun to show. Modernity was coming, and with it, a new kind of woman, educated, independent, and unafraid. The courtesans watched from behind their curtains as the city changed, knowing that their empire of smoke and silk would one day vanish. For now, though, the music still played, and the pipes still burned. The courtesans smiled beneath the haze, their eyes reflecting a truth the city refused to see in a world ruled by men. Illusion was the only power they had left. By the 1920s, Shanghai had become the Paris of the East, a city where jazz clubs throbbed with Western rhythms. Neon lights flashed across the Bund, and rickshaws raced through streets lined with silk shops and opium dens. But behind this glittering facade, the true pulse of the city beat in the private rooms of the courtesans. There, amid clouds of perfume and smoke, the destinies of men and nations were quietly influenced. Courtesans were no longer mere entertainers. They had become political instruments, conduits of information, and symbols of an empire's moral decay. A single evening in a flower house could resemble a diplomatic summit. British traders toasted with French officers, Chinese industrialists whispered to revolutionaries, and everyone sought the same thing: pleasure mixed with oblivion. The courtesans played their roles to perfection. They knew how to listen more than they spoke, how to flatter without revealing, how to give illusion the weight of intimacy. They mastered the subtle art of control through surrender. Every gesture was calculated: the way they poured tea, the tilt of the fan, the brush of a silk sleeve against a guest's hand. Their beauty wasn't merely physical, it was strategic. They made men believe they were adored, understood, even forgiven. In return, those men would reveal secrets, plans of trade routes, shipments, or political intrigue, sometimes without realizing it. One courtesan, known only as Lianghua, was said to have brokered peace between rival opium lords through a night of conversation disguised as flirtation. Another, Madame Jing, turned her flower house into a meeting place for foreign spies and Chinese reformers, using gossip as a weapon sharper than any blade. But this power came at a cost. Courtesans lived under constant surveillance, from the triads who owned their establishments, from police who collected bribes, and from jealous patrons who mistook possession for love. Every gift, every jewel, every promise came with invisible chains. Their alliances were fragile, and one wrong word could destroy them. A patron scorned might ruin her reputation. A rival courtesan could spread a single rumor that ended a career. To survive, they developed a sixth sense for danger, a talent for reading the invisible politics that governed every glance and gesture. The courtesan's influence stretched beyond pleasure. They shaped culture, too. Fashion houses copied their Q-pow styles, poets romanticized their melancholy, and painters immortalized their faces in oils. Even Western journalists, fascinated by their mystery, wrote about them as Oriental enchantresses who embodied the soul of Shanghai. Yet beneath these romanticized portraits was a darker truth. Many courtesans began as impoverished girls, sold by their families during famines or lured by false promises of prosperity. The education they received in the flower houses, how to play instruments, recite poetry, and serve men, was less about refinement and more about survival. They lived in constant contradiction, admired by society yet condemned by it. They were the jewels of Shanghai's nightlife and the shadows of its conscience. Their laughter filled the rooms, but it rarely reached their eyes. And always, there was the smoke. The faint aroma of burning opium mingled with perfume, masking the quiet desperation beneath the surface. Many courtesans used it not only to soothe their nerves, but to numb their hearts. They would inhale deeply, the ivory pipe cool against their lips, and for a few precious moments the world would dissolve. The debts, the betrayals, the memories of lost freedom. But when the smoke cleared, they were still in the same gilded prison, still trapped between luxury and despair. Outside, Shanghai marched toward modernity. The newspapers spoke of progress, of factories and suffrage movements. But inside those dimly lit rooms, time seemed frozen, a world ruled by scent, silk, and secrets. Because in a city built on illusion, it wasn't the politicians or the tycoons who truly held power. It was the women who understood that power could be disguised as a smile, and that sometimes, the most dangerous weapon in a corrupt world was beauty itself. In the late night quiet of Shanghai's French concession, when the streets glistened with recent rain and the last rickshaw had rattled away, a faint glow would still flicker behind the latticed windows of the courtesans' quarters. Inside, the air was thick with perfume and the ghostly silver of opium smoke. The world outside might have been roaring toward modernity, but within those chambers, time moved slowly, measured not in hours, but in heartbeats and exhales. Here, the courtesans lived in a fragile balance between love and survival. They were dream merchants, trained to sell the illusion of affection in a city that devoured tenderness. Each encounter was a performance, and every word carried weight. When a client entered the room, she became whatever he needed her to be: muse, mother, lover, or savior. But when the curtain fell and the last guest departed, the silence returned, sharp, almost unbearable. That was when the opium pipes came out. The ritual was delicate, almost sacred. A small pellet of black tar was placed on a needle, roasted gently over a lamp, then pressed into the bowl of an ivory pipe. The courtesan would lie on her side, resting her head against a pillow embroidered with peonies, and inhale the smoke in slow, elegant breaths. Her body would relax, her mind would drift, and for a while, the ache of her double life would fade. For many of them, this was not indulgence, it was medicine. A way to quiet the memories of what they had lost: childhood, freedom, the right to choose who to love. They used smoke as armor, floating above the sorrow that came from knowing that their beauty was both their fortune and their curse. Clients often mistook that serenity for contentment. They saw the languid grace, the soft laughter, and believed the courtesans lived enchanted lives. They didn't see the exhaustion beneath the coal-lined eyes, or the moments when a courtesan would stare at her reflection too long, as if trying to remember who she was before the world renamed her flower girl. There were rare moments, however, when love did bloom, unexpected, genuine, and dangerous. A poet would fall for his muse. A foreign trader would promise to take his favorite courtesan away to Paris or London. For a few weeks, they would believe in the fantasy of escape, but reality always returned. The courtesan belonged to the house, and her debts were ink deeper than affection could erase. One story, whispered through the tea houses, told of my shoe, a courtesan who fell in love with a young naval officer. They planned to flee the city together. But the night before their escape, her madam discovered the plan. By morning, Mei Shu had vanished. Some said she drowned herself in the Huangpu River. Others claimed she was sold to another house. Either way, her story became another verse in Shanghai's long ballad of doomed love. The opium soothed what love destroyed. It dulled the longing, made the impossible seem possible again. The courtesans would dream of better lives, perhaps as poets, singers, or wives in quiet countryside homes. But dawn always betrayed them. The smoke lifted, the makeup returned, and the performance began anew. Some courtesans developed a ritual of remembrance. They would keep a token, a poem, a fan, a coin, from a man they once loved. They didn't keep it for sentiment, but as proof that love had once touched them, even briefly, even if it left only pain behind. Outside, Shanghai's skyline was rising. The newspapers spoke of factories, stock exchanges, and suffrage clubs. The old world was being replaced by something faster, harsher. But in the courtesans' chambers, the rhythm of survival remained ancient. The same silken robes, the same whispered lies. The same need for the next puff of smoke to forget what the mirror revealed. Because the courtesans of Shanghai did not live for tomorrow. They lived for the moment between the inhale and the exhale. That fragile instant when the world disappeared, and they could pretend, if only for a heartbeat, that they were free. By the early 1920s, Shanghai had become a theater of contradictions. A city where skyscrapers rose beside opium dens, and limousines shared muddy roads with barefoot rickshaw pullers. It was called the Paris of the East, but beneath its glittering surface, a darker rhythm pulsed. Every night, as jazz bands played in the Bun's foreign clubs, and champagne bottles burst like tiny fireworks, the city's underbelly stirred. A shadow world where secrets were currency and beauty could cost a life. The courtesans were the centerpieces of this world, admired, envied, and quietly feared. They were the city's unofficial diplomats, privy to whispers that could topple reputations and ruin fortunes. In their dimly lit chambers, warlords confessed sins, tycoons plotted deals, and foreign officers let their masks slip. The courtesans listened, smiled, and remembered everything. But behind their charm was survival. They wore beauty like armor, hiding the bruises of both body and spirit. Powder, silk, and perfume weren't decorations. They were disguises. Each layer separated who they were from who the world demanded them to be. There was Madame Ling, a legend in her own right, known for her emerald coupe and her cold, mesmerizing gaze. No one knew her real age, or her real name. Some said she once belonged to a noble family before poverty sold her into the courtesan trade. Others believed she had murdered her first madam and taken over the house herself. Whatever the truth, her name inspired both reverence and fear. She understood Shanghai better than any politician. She knew that in a city built on vice, power came not from guns or gold, but from knowing what people hid. Every major scandal had a courtesan at its edge. When a British banker was found dead in his hotel room, rumors claimed it was the result of a jealous courtesan's revenge. When a government official suddenly resigned after a late night visit to a tea house, tongues wagged about the whispered blackmail that followed. The newspapers pretended not to know, but the gossip flowed through Shanghai like electricity. For the women trapped in this labyrinth, beauty was both a blessing and a curse. The more admired a courtesan became, the more she was imprisoned by her image. To fade was to die a social death. To age was to vanish. Some turned to opium to slow the clock, to blur the anxiety that came with watching younger faces replace theirs. Others turned to ruthless cunning, manipulating wealthy lovers into securing their futures before the spotlight dimmed. There were also those who tried to escape, to start anew as wives or businesswomen, but the city never forgot. Once labeled a courtesan, society refused redemption. Even the men who adored them in secret would not marry them in daylight. Shanghai's moral code was written by hypocrites, and the courtesans paid the highest price for its contradictions. And yet, amid the tragedy, there was defiance. These women created their own kind of empire. They built networks of loyalty and protection, hiring musicians, seamstresses, cooks, and even poets. Their salons became centers of art and conversation, where ideas were exchanged as freely as glances. Beneath the smoke and scandal, they preserved culture, poetry, dance, calligraphy, things the new world was trying to forget. As one old saying went, when the courtesans of Shanghai weep, the city loses its color. By the time the world noticed, Shanghai's courtesan culture had already become legend, a memory embroidered with silk and sorrow. The women who once ruled the night were fading into myth, their names surviving only in half-burned letters, forgotten photographs, and whispered stories shared by old men in tea houses. But even as time eroded their faces, their influence lingered. Because the courtesans of Shanghai were more than entertainers. They were witnesses to the soul of a city that sold beauty, bought secrets, and lived in the tension between ecstasy and ruin. By the 1930s, Shanghai had become the world's most intoxicating paradox, a city ruled as much by smoke as by steel. Behind its glittering facade of neon lights and Art Deco architecture, the real power flowed in silence through the thin, perfumed air of the opium rooms. And at the heart of it all stood the courtesans, the unseen brokers between vice and empire. The British had brought opium to China long before these women were born. What began as a colonial trade had seeped into every crevice of Chinese society, blurring the lines between commerce and corruption, pleasure and pain. By the time Shanghai bloomed into an international city, the British no longer needed warships to control it. The addiction itself did the job. The courtesans were both victims and instruments of that legacy. Their beauty was a commodity, but so too was their access to the men who mattered. The diplomats, smugglers, merchants, and warlords who fed the city's endless appetite for pleasure and power. Within the dim red glow of their salons, deals were whispered that would shape nations. Opium was the invisible guest in every gathering. It softened conversations, dulled suspicions, and made truth spill like wine. Many courtesans became connoisseurs of the pipe, not out of weakness, but out of ritual. To them, the slow curl of smoke was both an escape and a weapon. It made men vulnerable, easy to manipulate. A clever courtesan knew how to balance a pipe in one hand and a secret in the other. There was Lady Mai, known as the Lotus of the Bund. Elegant and razor-sharp, she entertained foreign investors by day and Chinese revolutionaries by night. She was said to have memorized the contents of dozens of confidential letters that passed through her chambers, selling information not for money, but for leverage. One whispered rumor claimed that she once convinced a British trader to betray his own partners, simply by smiling through the haze of her opium lamp. In these smoke-filled rooms, the boundaries of empire blurred. British aristocrats reclined beside Chinese generals, Russian exiles debated with Japanese industrialists, and everyone pretended that their world was stable. But Shanghai was a city built on instability. It thrived on secrets, blackmail, and illusions. Outside the courtesan's gilded world, the streets told a different story. Refugees from the countryside flooded the city, fleeing warlords and famine. Children begged in the shadows of luxury hotels. The divide between rich and poor had become obscene, yet even in the slums, the scent of opium lingered. A cheap dream sold by the ounce, a false promise of calm in a city spinning out of control. The government's attempts to ban the drug were performative at best. Officials railed against addiction in public while hosting private smoking parties in secret. Courtesans were often scapegoated, portrayed as corrupters of morals and symbols of decadence. But everyone knew the truth. They were merely reflections of a society already addicted to illusion. One English journalist, visiting a tea house near the French concession, described the scene in his diary. The smoke moves like a living thing, slow, deliberate, seductive. You forget time in here. The courtesan beside me speaks of politics like it's a game. Her laughter sharper than the flame of the lamp. In her eyes, I see the whole city beautiful, doomed, and utterly aware of its fate. And perhaps that was the true tragedy of Shanghai's courtesans. They understood better than anyone that the empire was built on sand. The foreign powers that adored them were already crumbling. The Chinese elite that financed them were losing grip. Yet, even as the world shifted around them, they continued their dance. Graceful, knowing, defiant. To the outsider, the courtesans were symbols of vice. But within the smoke, they became something else entirely. Historians of an empire that refused to right its own sins. Every night, as the pipes glowed and the city exhaled, one could almost hear it. The slow, rhythmic heartbeat of Shanghai's forgotten soul, pulsing beneath layers of silk, perfume, and smoke. Love was never simple in Shanghai's courtesan world. To the men who entered their rooms, love was a performance, a sweet illusion wrapped in silk and smoke. But to the women themselves, love was the most dangerous drug of all, far more intoxicating than opium and infinitely more cruel. Every courtesan knew the rule: never fall in love. Desire was business. Affection was strategy, and devotion could destroy everything. Yet in a city of fleeting pleasures, even the most disciplined hearts faltered. Some fell for foreign traders who promised escape. Others gave their hearts to poets or revolutionaries who spoke of a free China, but left them behind when the gunfire started. These men came seeking fantasy, the comfort of being worshipped, the illusion of being understood. The courtesans gave them what they wanted, often too well. They remembered favorite songs, the way a man took his tea, the tone he used when drunk or afraid. They became reflections of his desire, and in doing so, erased a little of themselves. There were moments, though, when the line between role and reality blurred. Under the flicker of oil lamps, words whispered through opium haze could feel real. A hand held too long, a laugh too soft, love, or something that looked like it, emerged. But for courtesans, love always came with a price. Those who chose to believe in it often paid dearly. A few were redeemed, bought out of the flower houses by wealthy patrons who promised devotion and luxury. Yet freedom under another man's roof was only another kind of prison. The gilded cage became smaller, quieter. Once adored for their wit and charm, they were now expected to be silent, obedient, invisible. Others who tried to leave on their own rarely survived. Without protection, they were prey to the gangs that ran the city, to debts that never truly ended, to the addictions that dulled their memories but quickened their ruin. One such story whispered through the courtesan quarters was of Lianhua, the lotus of the river district. She fell in love with a young Chinese journalist, a man who wrote fiery essays against corruption and foreign greed. He promised to take her away to Beijing to start anew, but when the revolution failed, he fled without her. Lianhua waited for weeks, her beauty fading, her debts growing. When the brothel keeper sold her opium pipe to cover costs, she walked to the Huangpu River at dawn and vanished into the mist. Her name became a ghost story, retold in hushed tones among the other women, not as tragedy, but as warning. Love, they said, was a luxury courtesans could not afford. Still, some refused to surrender their hearts entirely. They learned to love differently, through art, through friendship, through small acts of rebellion. They found solace in each other, in late night conversations where masks could finally fall away. These quiet sisterhoods were the unseen heart of Shanghai's Courtesan culture. Women who understood one another's suffering, who shared food, medicine, and secrets to survive. Even within the golden cage, some managed to carve out fragments of freedom. They composed poetry under false names, collected banned books, and hosted secret salons for writers and radicals. Beneath the painted smiles, they carried thoughts far sharper than the men who admired them ever imagined. To the world, they were ornaments, women of beauty and scandal, but behind closed doors, they dreamed of something more. Freedom was their forbidden wish, to walk unobserved, to choose their own fate, to live without needing to please anyone. And as the winds of war began to stir across Asia, that wish, fragile and impossible, began to feel less like fantasy and more like prophecy. For soon, the city that had once imprisoned them in luxury would itself become a cage of smoke and ruin. By the late 1930s, the once glittering dream of Shanghai began to crack beneath the weight of history. The city that had thrived on indulgence, deception, and smoke was now consumed by a different kind of fire, the fire of war. Japan's invasion of China in 1937 tore through the city like a storm. The Bund, once lined with shining cars and foreign bankers, filled with soldiers, refugees, and blood. The music halls fell silent, and the flower houses, those temples of illusion, began to close one by one. The sound of laughter, once the heartbeat of Shanghai's nights, was replaced by air raid sirens. For the courtesans, the fall came swiftly and cruelly. Their patrons fled, some back to Europe, others to safer provinces inland. Those who stayed behind had nothing left to spend. The grand brothels of the French concession turned into shelters for the displaced, their silk cushions now stained with dust and tears. The women who had ruled Shanghai's nights found themselves stripped of protection. Without wealthy clients or foreign guards, they were exposed to soldiers and criminals who saw them not as muses but as spoils. Many disappeared, taken by force, imprisoned, or left to wander the streets that once carried their laughter. The opium dens, too, changed. Where once smoke had risen to the rhythm of gentle music, now it was desperate, a numbing fog against hunger and loss. The courtesans who survived often turned back to the pipe, not for pleasure but for escape. Addiction no longer carried glamour. It was simply survival. Yet even in ruin, fragments of their old grace lingered. Some women, like the legendary Madame Wei, turned their fallen houses into clinics for the wounded. She burned her opium pipes, stitched bandages from old silks, and nursed soldiers who had once been her clients. When asked why, she said only, "It was never love I wanted, only peace." Others fled inland, seeking anonymity. They took new names, opened tea-houses or tailoring shops, and buried their pasts beneath modest smiles. A few managed to start anew, but most faded into the city's vast shadows. Their former splendor remembered only in whispers. Shanghai itself became a ghost of what it had been. The foreign powers that once ruled its districts abandoned their colonies, leaving behind empty mansions and decaying dance halls. The city's famous nightlife, once envied around the world, died quietly, choked by smoke, fear, and silence. Years later, when the war finally ended, the survivors of the courtesan age were old women. Their faces, once painted in the colors of seduction, now bore the soft lines of memory. They lived in cramped apartments or in the outskirts of the new, industrial city that had replaced their world. And yet sometimes, when the night was still and the lights along the Huangpu shimmered, one could almost imagine the old days. The sound of laughter from behind a paper screen, the perfume of jasmine mixed with opium smoke, the echo of a song long forgotten. The courtesans had lived as symbols of excess and scandal, but they were also witnesses to empire, revolution, and collapse. Their beauty had built a dream, Their suffering had outlasted it. They were, in a sense, the soul of Shanghai itself, alluring, tragic, and endlessly reborn. The flower houses were gone, their doors sealed by time. But their stories lingered in the dust, in old photographs, in songs sung by those who had never known their names. Because in the end, the courtesans were not merely women of pleasure. They were chroniclers of a city's rise and ruin. Ghosts of a world that once shimmered like gold through smoke. Time has a way of softening what it cannot erase. By the 1950s, the courtesans of Shanghai had vanished into history, their flower houses demolished, their portraits yellowed, their names reduced to half-remembered whispers. Yet, like smoke that clings to old silk, their presence never truly disappeared. It lingered, faint but undeniable, in the soul of the city they once ruled. Shanghai, now under new rule, sought to bury its decadent past. The new leaders wanted factories, not flower houses, loyalty, not luxury. The old opium dens were shuttered, the pipes destroyed. And the women who had once embodied the city's allure were erased from official memory. But even revolution could not cleanse the ghosts that drifted through the alleys of the French concession. Writers began to resurrect them, cautiously, in coded language. They spoke of singers or companions and women of culture, but their readers knew. Beneath the sanitized words lay stories of power and sorrow. Films and novels painted them as tragic heroines, women who loved too deeply or defied too boldly. The courtesans became mythic figures, halfway between sinners and saints. One of Shanghai's forgotten writers, Su Zimo, once described them as the mirrors of our desires. They show us not who we are, but who we wish to be. That sentiment endured. Decades after their demise, the courtesans remained symbols of a lost elegance, of a time when pleasure and pain danced in perfect rhythm. Tourists would later walk the restored lanes of Old Shanghai, Fuzhou Road, Hengshan Road, Suzhou Creek, and see the ghosts in the architecture, the curved windows, the fading murals, the ornate balconies that once overlooked carriages and carols. The city's modern neon lights were brighter, colder, but somewhere beneath them, the past still glowed. Some claimed to have seen them, figures in cupayos drifting past tea houses at dawn, their reflections lingering longer than the body that cast them. Others swore they heard music in the wind, faint notes of the old pipa or a half-sung love song carried across the river. Superstition, perhaps, or maybe memory refusing to die. What made their legend endure was not the glamour, but the tragedy beneath it. The courtesans were the ultimate contradiction. Women who appeared free but lived in bondage, who mastered illusion to survive reality. They represented both the beauty and the rot of their time. Their stories became Shanghai's confession, an acknowledgement that the city's greatness had been built on desire, deceit, and dreams too fragile to last. And perhaps that is why their ghosts still wander, not as vengeful spirits, but as keepers of memory. They remind Shanghai of what it once was, a place where the night belonged to those who could make men believe in fantasy. In the quiet hours, when the river is still and the lights ripple across its surface, one might imagine them sitting once more by the window, pipe in hand, staring at a city that has long forgotten their names. The smoke curls upward, carrying their final message, that beauty fades, but memory endures. For even if their faces are gone, their essence remains, in the silk that rustles in old wardrobes, in the scent of sandalwood that never leaves a room, in the eternal shimmer of Shanghai's nights. They are not gone. They are simply waiting, in the places where the past and present meet, where dreams dissolve like smoke. Even after their disappearance, the legacy of Shanghai's courtesans lingered, not just in stories or rumors, but in the very character of the city. The Shanghai that rose from the ashes of empire, and war carried within it the perfume of those forgotten women, the echo of their laughter, and the glimmer of their defiance. They had shaped a city that was unlike any other in Asia, cosmopolitan, sensual, bold, and unashamedly modern. The courtesans were not simply victims of desire, they were architects of culture. Through them, Shanghai learned to blend East and West, tradition and rebellion, elegance and sin. Their drawing rooms had once hosted poets, revolutionaries, and businessmen. Ideas that would later define modern China about art, love, gender, and freedom were born in their candle-lit salons, whispered between sips of wine and clouds of smoke. They taught men how to perform sophistication. They set the fashions, the cut of a qiupiao, the style of a coiffure, the taste in perfume and poetry. The courtesans were influencers before the term existed, shaping aesthetics and attitudes from the hidden rooms of the French concession. And through them, Shanghai became the city of glamour it is still remembered as, a place where style was a form of power. But their legacy was also more subtle, more haunting. Beneath the glitter lay a warning. They embodied the price of beauty, the fragility of illusion. Each elegant pose hid exhaustion, each polished smile, the cost of survival. In that sense, they became mirrors of the human condition, proof that every civilization has its shadows, and that every empire writes its sins in silk and song. As the decades passed, artists and historians began to reclaim their memory in museums and literature. The courtesans were no longer dismissed as immoral figures, but reimagined as cultural icons. Women trapped in their time yet ahead of it. They became symbols of agency, resilience, and artistry, reclaiming a place in history that had long denied them dignity. Modern Shanghai, with its skyscrapers and neon skyline, is still built upon that tension between the yearning for modernity and the longing for the past. The courtesans represented that eternal contradiction, the dream of freedom in a world that profits from control. Even today, when night falls over the Bund and the Huangpu River glows with city lights, one can still feel that lingering pulse. A rhythm born a century ago in the boudoirs and Opium, scented salons of women who refused to be invisible. Perhaps that is their truest legacy. They showed that beauty, even when used as currency, can become resistance. That art, even in bondage, can outlive its masters. That memory, when wrapped in silk and smoke, becomes eternal. And so their story is not one of disappearance, but transformation. The courtesans of Shanghai may have faded from sight, but they remain the soul of the city, not in its monuments, but in its moods. In every shadowed alley, in every song about lost love, in every flicker of nostalgia that passes through the Shanghai night. Their names are forgotten, but their essence endures, soft as velvet, sharp as glass, eternal as desire. The smoke has cleared, the empire has fallen. But the courtesans, they remain, forever dancing in the memory of the city that could never let them go.